You guys know that I give credit where credit's due, even when it's Russia. But looking at the Battle of Novomykhilivka, the Ukrainian 79th Air Assault Brigade looks to be kind of mopping the floor with the Russian forces there. And I gotta ask, is there anyone actually in charge of these Russian troops? I'm going to break down just what my problem is and why I think this is such a bad deal for the Russians. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's get into it. All right, so this is a map here of the town of Novomykhilivka and the control around it. This is as of the 6th of January. Now, Russia has primarily been focusing on the Marinka town, a village that's been contested for months and months and months, and it seems like Russian forces have finally ejected the last of the Ukrainian defenders from Marinka, which has enabled them to pivot their attention over to Novomykhilivka, which makes sense for a lot of reasons. You can see Russian forces advancing into these open fields south of Marinka has created an almost kind of encirclement of the town of Novomykhilivka. Ukrainian defenders, namely the 79th Air Assault Brigade, are really trying to come up with a crafty strategy that forces the Russians to burn a lot of their men and material. And let me show you why. So let's advance through time. You can see as of the 7th, you can see that the 79th actually drove the Russian forces back basically to this tree line here. Now, when you look at the topographic map, well, let's move forward a couple more days. You can see Russian forces trying to retake some of their low-value territory, these thin windbreaks here, but this takes us to the 11th. There hasn't really been any measurable progress by Russian forces in the subsequent days. Now, the only place that Russian forces seem to be able to retain is this small pair of windbreaks here on either side of this lake or river, creek, really. But the thing to remember is, again, you've got Russian forces knocking on the doors of Novomykhilivka and then getting driven back by the 79th. So look at the topographic map. This is where I think things are significant and why I worry so much about the competence of Russian commanders. You can see Novomykhilivka itself is a pretty flat area. Now, you can see the red is some of the highest elevations, and Russia kind of controls these heights around the town of Novomykhilivka, which makes sense, right? Because you can see on the control map that more or less tracks with where the actual battlefield control is. So, Russian commanders here are effectively using this terrain, this high ground, in order to create their salient. And Ukrainian commanders have correctly figured out that it's probably not worth it to try to push the Russians out of any of this high ground. Where things get weird is, as you guys can see, the actual town of Novomykhilivka is in very, very low ground. You note that the pale blue in the map denotes areas that are only 135 meters of elevation. So when we look at the Russian forces, right, where they advanced, literally, when they advanced off of this red zone, these elevated positions, they began to move towards the town of Novomykhilivka and expose themselves on plain, flat, open ground. And the defenders from the 79th, by all accounts, seem to have allowed the Russian forces to actually advance up to the edge of the town before counterattacking and driving them back. And this is the thing to take away, is that, again, Russian forces relatively secure in some of these elevated positions to the south, to the east, and to the north of the town. But once they leave those elevated positions, that's when they become vulnerable. So, over from the 6th to the 11th, you can see exactly what has happened here, right? Russian forces actually occupied some of this flat ground. And then on the 6th, you see Ukrainian forces counterattacking, driving them back into the heights here, wiping out all the Russian gains and taking out a considerable amount of Russian manpower in the process. But look where Russia has clung to. They've clung right along this creek. Well, notice the color of this creek on the terrain map, guys. This creek is absolute low ground. Now, I'm not going to tell you that low ground is valueless, right? sometimes occupying this low ground you can turn it into sort of trench of your own, right? Like a naturally occurring trench. But it only works, right? Naturally occurring trenches only work when you have friendlies to your back. These troops do not have friendlies to their back. They have enemy on either side of them. So just try to imagine you're in a hole in the ground, and on either side of you are enemy above you. Do you see how incredibly problematic trying to hold this strip of terrain will be for Russian troops? Again, note the color. It is very blue. That is because, and water is pooling here because this is extremely low ground. So the fact is, not only have Russian forces been forced back to the high ground, the sliver of territory they still control is problematic because it is a literal shooting gallery. You may be asking yourselves, why would the 79th continue not push the Russians out if this is such a shooting gallery? Well, the answer is the Russians appear to have a policy of not one step back, right? Sound familiar? Yeah, it's a very Soviet-era policy. And if you know the enemy is going to continually reinforce a shooting gallery, what you're going to do is just keep putting quarters in the machine and keep shooting targets as they appear, right? It's like any other shooting gallery. You want to have fun, don't you? And so for Russian troops who cannot retreat if they're able to hold a region, they really may not be able to understand that this area is just simply not going to work. The other thing is that the only way to relieve these troops for Russia is to continue to advance along basically one of two salients. And you can see they've tried to advance across this open terrain here, and they're, by most accounts, I can't show you the accounts. I can't show you the videos that appear on X, but I've reviewed a lot of them, and we're going to actually take a look at more of them here later today, but on combatvetnews.com. Sorry, that's where it's going to drop. If you're not already a member of combatvetnews.com, this is where we look at the drone footage, the POV footage of these battles. I can't put it on YouTube, so in order to stay independent, right, I have combatvetnews.com, where twice a week we drop the combat footage from these battles. We do the deep dive analysis. We look at the footage. We do the terrain analysis, but it's for members only. So if you have $5 and you want to support the channel, keep me independent, that would be a huge help. Of course, if you want to support my content with a lieutenant or colonel tier, man, I appreciate you guys and absolutely love shouting you out. But the thing to take away from this is the fact that the 79th has an incentive to continue to not just take out Russian forces as they try to reinforce and remain in this incredibly tenuous position, but they also have an incentive to bait Russian forces to continue to leave this high ground and advance into the much more vulnerable low ground that surrounds Novomykhilivka. And you can see when we look at the map, right, that if they indeed want to make some of these advances, you can literally see how this empty field, right, kind of elevated, but the next area where the Russian forces will attack moves them ever closer to low ground, exposing them if they want to try to reinforce either of these flanks. So you can see that the 79th, who likely isn't doing much more than routine counterattacking, simply is lying in wait as Russian forces continually throw assault after assault at Novomykhilivka, at this flat, open terrain where they are unbelievably vulnerable. And the result, of course, is nothing but highlight reel drone videos of Russian armor getting absolutely smoked. And the fact that Russian commanders don't seem to be bothered by this is honestly pretty head-scratching. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. Be sure to check us out later today for when on combatvetnews.com when I do the thorough breakdown of this combat footage, and we'll try to identify or illustrate just how these tactics work. Hit like and subscribe. See ya.